So ahead of this month's Global Education Summit in London, I'm delighted to be joined by one member of the Cambridge Partnership for Education Advisory Board, who's here to discuss how to develop education systems better fit for learners. We're going through a period of intense disruption at the moment in the whole of society, not just education, and that undoubtedly gives great opportunities to enact change. But it also carries the risk as well of decisions being made without appropriate evidence backing or research out of a sense to need to act urgently. And I think as leaders from across the world gather together now to support education transformation, it's really important that we unpack how best to design and deliver this change for the benefit of all learners and of wider society. And to discuss this further, I'd like to introduce Professor Pauline Rose. Pauline joined the University of Cambridge in 2014 as a Professor of International Education, and she's also Director of the Research for Equitable Access and Learning, or REAL Centre, in the Faculty of Education. Prior to joining Cambridge, Pauline was Director of the Education for All Global Monitoring Report, and she's written many publications on issues that examine educational policy and practice, including in relation to inequality, financing and governance, and the role of international aid. Pauline has worked on many large collaborative research programmes with teams in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, examining these issues, and throughout her career she's worked very closely with international aid organisations and NGOs, providing that evidence-based policy advice on a wide range of issues. So Pauline, welcome.
Thank you.
In your work, you're frequently leading these conversations around how to reform education systems to ensure resilience. So what do you think are the three most important things to bear in mind when trying to make change happen at system level?
So the three things that I would put forward is first to start by focusing on the most marginalised. If we get education systems right for the most marginalised, whether that's children who are living in poverty, girls, those in rural, remote areas or in urban slums, children with disabilities, those from ethnic and linguistic minority groups, for example. If we get it right for them, it will be right for everybody. So that should be the absolute starting point. The second point would be to make sure that we have the finances in place. It's both about the amount of money, whether from governments or aid donors, but also the distribution of that finance, again, to make sure that it's reaching the most marginalised and that it's also prioritising levels of education at which the most marginalised currently reach. So we know, from the evidence that most of the most marginalised children in the poorest countries, in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, don't make it beyond primary school even. So when we're putting a lot of money into higher education, that means that it's already bypassing those children. And thirdly, I would say put teachers at the centre of any systems reform process to really understand how it affects teachers, what the teachers' views and perspectives are on what reforms are needed, rather than them being the product of any reform, to actually be part of the process of it.
Thank you, Pauline. And three critical factors there. I want to move on to look at what sort of change might be possible. Countries made a really strong statement at a recent Global Partnership for Education board meeting, saying education systems need to be transformed, not tweaked. They said the world needs bold actions, not more of the same, to create strong education systems that achieve education outcomes at scale and address systemic inequities. So what kind of radical changes do you think we could make happen today? What foundations do you think we need to set in motion to make changes happen over the next 5 years? And also, who needs to be involved and be part of that change?
Yeah, to start with the sort of first point on radical reform, the word radical always, on the one hand, I'm fully in favour of trying to be radical. At the same time, I think we've got to be careful that we don't actually sort of jump from the very basics that we still need to get right. So, sometimes there's a sort of excitement in education to move to the latest form of technology, to sort of think of new and innovative things, but actually we haven't got the basics right in terms of curriculum reform, in terms of how we use assessments, learning assessments, to make sure that learning improves within the classroom. And so I think really starting with those very basics. And by curriculum reform, one of the things I would include within that is to make sure that the curriculum is fit for purpose for those most marginalised children. So many children, as we know, are spending time in school and not learning the basics in literacy and numeracy. They might also not be gaining self-confidence or problem-solving skills, critical thinking skills, etc. And really making sure that the curriculum is fit for purpose from that starting point is absolutely vital. So in many ways, this isn't a new idea. I mean, this is what we expect any education system to do. And yet it's surprising that when you look at the curriculum of many countries, this is not what it's currently focused on. That it's often focused on moving at quite a fast pace, far beyond the pace of those who are struggling to keep up. And it's also focusing on within short periods of time, trying to get students to quite a high level. Yet, if students haven't got to that basic level, they're never going to reach that high level. They've already either explicitly dropped out of school altogether or are sitting in a classroom and dropping out in other ways by just not being able to participate fully. So I think that's absolutely vital to get the curriculum right in the first place and to make sure that it is fit for purpose for the children that are being catered for. I think we've got to remember in relation to this that part of what the reason for the need for this is because we've made huge progress in some respects. We've got many more children into the lower grades of primary school, again in the poorest countries, than we have ever seen before. So countries like Ethiopia, where we're doing a lot of work, for example, on the Research for Improving Systems of Education RISE programme, we've seen that it's moved within a period of less than 20 years from an elite primary schooling system to a mass primary schooling system. And the curriculum that you would need obviously will change as a result of that. But the radical reform that's needed of moving from that elite to the mass system has not happened as yet. So I think really sort of thinking about these very basic things and making sure that all children have an opportunity to achieve a basic and foundational skills in a holistic sense of learning, so both academic and other forms of socio-emotional learning, etc., is absolutely key.
And who would you involve in that change? Who do you need to bring with you?
So I think, at the one level, it's obviously the government policy makers, those that are making the decisions, those in the Ministry of Education, but absolutely it needs to involve the teachers. So the teachers understand the circumstances in their classrooms, the sort of things that they struggle with and how they, the challenges that they face in terms of trying to make sure that the children are learning the basics. And some of those challenges might be to do with the structures. It might be to do with the assessment system, which is prioritising making sure that a sufficient number of children are getting to a certain assessment grade. But that then means that there's not a priority being put on those children who actually need additional support and focus within the classroom. So maybe it's about that type of reform that's needed. But they might be in a classroom with over 100 children in them, and the type of approaches that are being discussed in many contexts of moving to a learner-centred approach, etc., might sound extremely valuable, but actually the reality for teachers with limited support and limited training in going about this could be extremely challenging. And even with that support and training, how do you do it with so many children? So you need to make sure it's really tailored to that experience within the classroom itself. So I think starting from the teachers and working upwards is absolutely vital.
Thank you, Pauline. Some really valuable thoughts there, and thank you for taking the time to discuss with us today.
Thank you.